First of all, for those of you who I don't know, and I've talked to many, many people, I'm staring over to the right because there's a long list of people who are checked in remotely. I'm Ted Worth. I've been working with WIoT for about 8 months and with a number of you in commercializing the products that you're bringing to market. One of the things that became very obvious through the discussions is there's a common thread of needing a little bit more baseline on funding when it comes to commercialization. So this presentation was put together to talk about funding through the commercialization process. There's going to be a second part in about 1 month, which will be more the logistics, the mechanics of how do you form a spin out, if you form a spin out, what roles you might have in that spin out, and what the money, rewards, and so forth might be. And so that has yet to be scheduled, but it will be scheduled. I am joined on the big screen here in the room. Stacy, just so you know, there's like 7 people, 8 people in the room. And in addition to the people that are remote, Stacy's from Mass Ventures, which is actually one of the venture arms of the state. But more importantly, Mass Ventures runs a whole bunch of programs targeted at researchers. And Stacy's going to I'll go through the agenda. Do you want to maybe introduce yourself in Mass Ventures?
Yeah, sure. Mass Ventures is one of the oldest venture capital firms in the nation, I think even in the world. It was founded in 1978. It was started from a state grant, but it's run an evergreen fund ever since. But as Ted pointed out, that we also manage some granting programs for the state. One just opened up today called the START program that does SBIR matching. We manage the ACORN program, which helps do translational work from the research to the lab. We also manage the Catalyst program for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. So we do a lot of support of university spinouts, as well as just normal equity investment. And we generally invest in the very early stage, so seed and Series A.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. And we're going to be going, I'm actually going to be a little bit more methodical about talking about funding. It's critical that you understand the phases of commercialization because funding from research to market changes tremendously. Who invests, why they invest. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about what needs to be funded because when you go out for funding, there's things that need to be funded, things that don't need to be funded. And then we're going to talk about how to find funding. And Stacy actually will do a little bit deeper dive into SBIR funding, because that's one of the big sources of bigger funds that's available in the state. So, all right. Briefly, I did want to talk about commercialization itself. This is a slide I typically put up whenever I talk to researchers. You're doing a lot of very valuable work that in translation into the real world can solve real world problems. And we don't want to lose that. There's a tremendous reward for society. But I also want to mention there's a lot of benefits for your research as you go through this. You can enhance future funding. You're going to see a lot of funding will come in for commercialization that is in addition to basic research funding. You can share in the reward. So there really is a prestige in dollars that can come with success. And you also can contribute to university prestige. So here are the phases of commercialization. And as I said, these are quite distinct. Funding that comes in can be very different. I'm not going to talk so much about basic research because there's a whole bunch of efforts to do granting and funding around basic research. We're really focused on the commercialization process, which comes after. Basic research, from my perspective, creates ingredients. The rest of this process is going to create pastry. Use-inspired research is basically tagging on to research where you're now trying to see, is there a specific area in the real world that can use something that came out through basic research. After use-inspired is proof of concept. Now you're actually going after a real world problem, you're creating something that might work, and you're starting to understand, is there a real market out there, how big it is, how hard it is to get to. Pre-seed is where you are forming a company. You're starting to look at what are the business necessities. A lot of it is around business model. And a business model is economics. Can you get enough money in from customers? Can you generate something that has enough value to pay for it? And is it big enough to really matter? And then finally, early stage is when you are scaling a business. You're looking to grow the business and prove that it can scale over time and become self-sufficient. The work being done in the lab is all about creating patents. And these patents become a tangible value, whether you end up licensing your software, your IP, or building your own company. This is the only time I'm going to talk about licensing to outside industry. Outside industry is interested in tech coming from the universities because it allows them to build barriers around their business and to go places that nobody else can go. The other path, which is the spin-out path, Northeastern's a pretty active organization when it comes to spin-outs. As of a year ago, there was probably 50 plus businesses. There were somewhere between a glimmer in someone's eye and in the case of Cypher, raising $80 million. So they just closed $80 million out of the Barabasi lab. So this is the process that you put in place. When you create a patent, it can turn into a license, and then everything moves forward. Are they having trouble hearing me? Or? Oh, okay. So let's talk at a high level about the progression effort. Most of you in the work you're doing are in the use-inspired. Some of you are in proof of concept with the work that you're doing. This is intended to very high level communicate what's the level of effort going through technical problem solving and business resources. Obviously, early on, there's very little business investment that has to be made. There is a juncture where research drops off rapidly, business picks up tremendously. I'll talk actually what are the elements of that on the next slide. And this is a juncture where when we talk about, when I present next week or in 4 weeks on part 2, we'll talk about what is your role at this pivot point. Do you want to be part of the spin out, what that might look like, and so forth. But in general, you can see that the amount of funding is very little business at first. It starts to ramp on the business resource side, and then on your technology, while there's a pretty big investment up through proof of concept, that starts to wind down as you go forward from there. All right, really busy slide. This is, if you focus on the top part, and for the people in the room, I guess it doesn't really work to do that, does it? Above the red line is the tech area. This is the work that you will do through the process. And the key things are, early on, you're doing research. You're trying to make a connection to a real world problem. Then as the expenses and money that you raise goes into prototypes, and ultimately creating some sort of a minimal viable product, which is something you would use when you go out to try to test this in the real world. On the business side, starts very small. Starts with commercialization, just knowing that commercialization exists, and someday you'd like to do that with your IP and so forth. But as it grows through this, you have to define what's the industry connection. Wyatt has tremendous resources connecting into industry that this group can take advantage of and really should, to better understand what are the problems going on in industry. As you move to proof of concept, there's an idea of customer discovery. This is where we're actually talking to real customers, trying to figure out what are their needs, what are their constraints, and is there some sort of a match with the technology. You can see as you get to the rightmost early stage investment, tremendous amount of money spent to build and scale a business, and all of them are in areas other than research. The common element here, leading into the rest of the presentation, is funding. We are going to talk about funding through this stage. So I'm a big believer. My company went through all the stages of acquiring money. We raised, at the end of the day, add it all together, because that's what people tend to do. We raised about $46 million to help with different stages. Who you get to invest at different stages are really driven by two things. One is, how long is it going to take for you to be successful? And the second one is, what's the risk of failure? And the longer it takes and the higher the risk, the harder it is to find someone who's willing to essentially throw their money into the pool and to see what happens. Just a quick indicator with the basic research time, it's an average of about 15 years until you get to some sort of a operating business. And it's really inefficient. It takes about $80 million of research dollars to end up with one business that's able to go out. And that's a countrywide metric. That's not a Northeastern metric. If you notice, this does not go to zero. The risks do not go to zero. When you get to the right-hand side, now you're at the point where you're starting to raise money to scale your business. The investors are completely different. We'll talk about them on the next slide. But the time is still 5 years away on the average to being able to have a viable business. The risk is still pretty high. Research-derived businesses are more efficient. They don't fail as often when they're launched correctly because they're based on IP and things that have tangible value to allow them to differentiate. But so this number, 60%, is actually far more successful than all the other ventures that might be spinning out that are not research-based. Real quick example, Fusion. I love to use Fusion because this year, or last year, very end of last year, Fusion got to the point of proof of concept. They had one company that was able to prove that they could generate positive energy out with the anticipation that they're going to be creating a business in the future. It took $16 billion to get to the proof of concept, and that's all research-based money. And there are companies that are now raising hundreds of millions of dollars to go after fusion energy. And the promise is it's actually going to be delivered. They think the first plant is going to be in about 10 to 15 years. So that's an extreme. Northeastern has examples of many businesses. If you go to health sciences, it's maybe 10, 15 years from basic research to early stage. And we have examples of some IP that is based on artificial intelligence, machine learning, software-based businesses that in 2 years have gone from use-inspired research to having formed a company. So the amount of time it takes is very dependent on the technology. Any questions so far? I should say that I thrive in having people interrupt with questions. It's harder to do remotely, but I'll try. Okay. So who can afford to fund in this time frame at the different stages? Early on, it's really governments and foundations. I actually have exactly who's investing on the next slide, but the reason they invest is they have these altruistic goals to protect our country and help save the world. Those are the types of thought process you have to go through because you're such long-term in your investment and so high a rate of failure. When you go to the middle of this phase, there's the corporate SWOT is really referring strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, which is a corporate way of looking at the world. And they are the ones that start to predominantly pick up funding in proof of concept. And then there's places like the mass ventures, which are investing into these types of processes. And their goal is to make Massachusetts a wonderful place for its citizens to work and live. And then as you get towards the later stage, you're really into the people that just want to make money. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but really gotten to the point that VCs, and we'll talk about who they are willing to now put their money into the risk levels and timeframes because they think they can make a lot of money back from that. All right, I have two slides that will sort of I hope you can see these okay. This is where the money comes from. The left three pie charts are actual data of where the money comes from. The numbers at the top are the sum total of those buckets. So you can see several things coming out of those three areas, and this is really the early part of commercialization. One of them is the amount of money goes up substantially. It takes a lot of money to bring products to market. It starts around 100 billion a year, goes up to 400. But more importantly, look at who's putting this money out. The big contributor government drops as a percentage of the pie, and industry picks up tremendously as it goes through this process. When you look at the early stage investment, completely different set of investors. You're looking at friends and family. We'll talk briefly about that later. Angels, which is a category of investors, and then venture capitalists, who are all contributing money to try to go through the stages. So this is a slide that's much more relevant. It demonstrates the challenge that you have going through this process. This is how much money is going where. And for the left three slides, pay attention to the yellow area, because that's the part going to the university. And the numbers at the bottom, 49, 22, 7.3, that's the money that's going towards universities in that pie. So it's very well known that there's less money in this, I'll call it a dead period of business development, where it's hard to get money because you've reached the point where the idea exists and there's a hurdle to get over it. And there's one set of funding sources that likes one, and there's another set of sources that like the others. The university to be now counted as a business or by your I'm sorry, ask what? So they are, it's both. I probably should have said early on, whenever you look at these charts, there's an overlap tremendously between these, the data that comes out of the phases. Those will be spinouts. So there's spinouts that are tapping that money, and then there's a lot of other programs. And that's one of the things Stacey's going to talk to you about, is some of the programs that exist to help you get through that time period. And then on the right, unfortunately, focus on the green. That's the area that's at the earliest stages, the one that's going to impact the work that we do. There's a couple of companies in WIoT today that are in the phase of their stage looking for funding. And it's not a big part of the pie. The reason why is because the risks go down over time and people are willing to put a lot of money into something once the risks are better characterized. So keep this in mind when you go out for funding. All these slides are put together so far so that you understand the mindset and what people are thinking when they invest into your efforts. Okay, we're going to switch gears and talk about where the funding comes from. And there's two distinct areas. There's sort of the idea funding side, and Stacey's going to talk about that with a deep dive into SBIR. I'm going to come back and talk about business funding at the end. And this is once you're kicking off a business, what are the different mechanisms? What's the different amount of money out there? Or what are the different places you can go to get money for that stage? So Stacey, are you able... There you are.
Yeah, here I am.
Awesome. So let me go ahead. Just tell me when you want me to switch slides.
Okay, that sounds great. That was a really great overview, Ted. And like he said, we're going to just talk briefly about that early stage of funding. So you have this idea, you want to make a proof of concept, you maybe want to spin it out. Actually, if we go back to the previous slide, there's a lot of sources of funding. If you're still at the university, please look at the ACORN grants. Also, your own university probably has some internal programs that you're aware of. There's state agencies that offer grants. When it comes to nonprofits, I looked at this with Gates Foundation, which, I mean, they put like billions and billions of dollars out. It's massive, but they tend to put a lot of money, like back in, like, I'll do a call back to Fusion. They put a lot into Fusion. They tend to do grants to other nonprofits though, like big universities, big global efforts. So the nice thing about SBIR is it's the one funding mechanism that really, really, really targets startups. It's dedicated only to startups and to for-profit companies. So it's actually less competitive than a lot of other mechanisms. So let's flip to the next slide. We'll get into that. Oh, it's the same list here. And then when it comes to strategics, that can be really hard. I find with strategics, it's just before you get real money from them, they tend to want to see the proof of concept anyway. So you're better off still starting with an SBIR, in my humble opinion, although sometimes things happen out of order. And when you have one of those things that goes really quickly in 2 years, which in your space could happen, like then you might jump on things all at once. Like everything's going quickly. Next slide. But let's talk about SBIR. This is a federal program managed by the Small Business Administration. The Small Business Administration does not issue SBIRs. They're the umbrella organization that makes sure that everything's like legal and up to snuff, and they manage the information. And their website is sbir.gov. You can sort of see it in black at the very bottom. of the slide there, SBIR.gov. You can find a lot of information about SBIR there. But it's a 1982 law. It was put forth under the Ronald Reagan presidency. And there's 11 participating agencies. So you'll recognize that Department of Defense on this pie chart, if you add in NASA, it does fully half of all SBIRs. It's about $3 billion a year goes out on SBIR. Health and Human Services, which you'll think of as National Institute of Health or NIH and CDC, they do the bulk of the rest. You guys would be targeting NSF, probably maybe NASA, Department of Energy. So it's still a lot of money to be had out there. Then there's little ones, Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, they're little baby ones, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, EPA. Next slide. So it's a 3-stage program, and phase 1 is typically a little tiny program, $150,000, $250,000, 6 months long. It's just like, they call it the get to know you period. It's hard to get funded. I recommend working with someone like me or Dan Lilly in the Massachusetts Small Business Development Center. Any sort of a coach, I think, takes your chance of winning from like 20% to 50%, just because there's so much compliance. Most of you are probably used to applying for federal funding, and it's actually a really similar process. And that's really the provenance for SBIR, and that's who the reviewers are for the most part. But the goals of SBIR are very different. So phase 2, you tend to get $750K to up to $3 million at NIH. NIH is very generous. And phase 3 is just more of a concept that they use. It means you've gone into the commercialization phase. So it really takes you about 3 years to pull in all that money. It's okay to have multiple programs going on at one time. I had like 3 SBIRs going on at the one time. One time I had like 4 years, 3 SBIRs, phase 1s and phase 2s. So we have 4 years to commercialize. In this case, it was a scintillator for nuclear detection. So the programs just had to be different. You have a different statement of work. As long as it's a different statement of work, you can have different agencies and the same agency even funding actually what's the same product. But it is incumbent on you, because it's slow, right? It takes 6 months to get, you write it, you send in the application. It takes 4 months to hear back. So it takes 6 to 9 months just to get the first award. And then you're kind of living with that statement of work for 6 months. And then you do your phase 1 report, then you apply for phase 2, and then that's 2 years. So there is a bit of, I know you're all very clever, but you had to just be a little bit business clever and make sure that it aligns with, your business. If you find yourself drifting, these are just human beings. They're government service, they're government servants, they're awesome people, the program managers. So like each agency, say you apply to NSF, then within NSF, there's like 20 categories, and you'll have your person, your program manager, phone call. Hey, you know what? We found some new information. We need to make an adjustment, and they're generally really great about it. So it's research, it's cutting edge. Ironically, the more cutting edge you are, the harder it is to find venture in the early stages, because everyone's like, what are you talking about? But in SBIR, these are the same people at NSF that have been funding all the cutting edge research. So they totally get you. They totally get it. They're really your people. But now you just have to have like the commercialization plan, and you have to have an actual company. So you actually have to go to Massachusetts, Department of Revenue, and like form a company. And then the people working on the program have to be 51% of their time committed to that company. Now they can be 1099s. You don't have to be like a full-time employee, but there's a lot of eligibility requirements there. Next slide. I'm probably jumping ahead. There we go. Eligibility. Your principal investigator must be employed by the firm, but only has to put in 10% of their time to the SBIR. And your principal investigator generally is someone with a PhD. I don't have a PhD, and I was a PI, but generally it's someone with a PhD. And at least 66% of the work must be accomplished by the firm. So I'm getting a bit into the weeds here, but there's a lot of requirements about how you use the money. You have to pay yourselves. A big part is just going to be salary. And you have to have some overhead. They call that, what do they call that? I'm spacing. They don't call it overhead. I forget. It's not GAAP. The work must be performed in the US. This is US taxpayer money. And you may use subcontractors, and you may even use your own university as a subcontractor, whether it's an SBIR or what's called an STTR. And STTR basically just means you can push more money and more work to the university. Next slide. But when you're writing a proposal, of course, it's all about them, right? So this is basically a sale. It's a pitch. And it's very similar to proposals you've written before. Again, it's just going to be a little more commercial. Understand that these agencies need to go to Congress, once a year, provide a report and explain what the heck they've been doing with the money. So they think like early stage investors. They want unicorns too. They want to be able to say, hey, we invested in Ginkgo Bioworks 10 years ago, and now look at them. They're worth $10 billion or whatever they're worth, right? So, and also like tie the line. If you've been funded by NSF and now you're translating that work to a company, tell them that. Even if you're applying to NIH and you had previous funding from NSF, they still want to see that. That really helps them do their job. But then it's your classic Heilmeyer catechism, right? So what, who cares, why you, right? But they're also looking, what's the impact? You have to, of course, substantiate your claims. Please, please, please find some way to say your market is $1 billion or more. Find a way. What's your unfair advantage? And then, of course, they're funding you for the work. So you have to have a very detailed work schedule. Like this person's going to work on it. They're going to work on this many hours on it. And of course, in the end, a great team. Even if it's just advisors, be sure to put them in there. Next. 5 tips, Stacy's 5 tips. First thing you do is talk to the program manager. NSF has their own project pitch process. But if it's DOD, Department of Energy, NIH, get them on the phone. What are you looking for? And also read their mission statements. And also if they have any references in their solicitation, read the references because it tells you a lot about what they're looking for. And then tip 2, come out swinging. Just come out swinging. They're exhausted. You've probably been reviewers yourselves, right? You're tired. It's 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. The baby's crying. Get their attention. Use active language. Please use spell check and grammar check. It's for me, when I'm reviewing things, it's it just catches me like a thorn when it's that's spelled wrong. Like I said, connect your innovation to past agency funding if possible. And then know that it takes 100 hours. If your whole attitude is I'm going to hire somebody to write this for me, you won't get funded. Okay. This is your sale to your customer on your product. Own it. Own it. Take the time to write it and do a good job. It's okay to ask for support, but do not, never, ever, ever, ever in the early stages of your company, ever outsource a sale or a relationship. Make your relationship, make your sales. These people talk to other people. They're good people to know. And some agencies like DOE, NIH, they have a lot of funding mechanisms. They can support you beyond SBIR as well. I think that's it. I think I'll hand it back to Ted. Oh, why you would lose. Number 1, you missed the deadline. You're not compliant. Okay. When they say you got 15 pages in the PDF, that's it. Their robot will count the pages, their computer robot. If it's 15 and a half, they're kicking you out. That proposal never sees the light of day. You just get an email message nope, not accepted. Again, lack of technical detail, lack of true innovation, too ambitious. It's phase 1, keep it small. It's okay to do a paper study. If you're just clueless about the state of the art, again, they've been funding it. So they know your competition better than you do. Trust me. They're really, this is what they do all day, every day, right? And if it's just inadequate potential, so you can read the list. Next, more information. SBIR.gov, grants.gov is where you can look for opportunities. And then DoD, SBIR, STTR, where you can look for topics on the DoD side. The DoD has 3 solicitations a year. NSF is rolling and it's open topic, 3 application deadlines a year. NIH is kind of open topic, 3 application deadlines a year. Department of Energy has 2 solicitations a year. They have topics. So you can type in just like DOE SBIR and you will get to their page, and you can say NIH SBIR, NSF SBIR, and you can find whatever you need. You are welcome to reach out to me at Mass Ventures for SBIR coaching. And also I put up the MSBDC. If you type in MSBDC and SBIR, you'll probably find Dan Lilly's landing page. And he's also really helpful and help tons of companies hop on SBIRs. That's it.
Okay. Just one thing I'd like to add. Thank you very much, by the way, for that. A couple of things I'd like to add. One is the university has a number of resources. They will give money to different stages within the commercialization process. You've got the Spark Fund, which is earlier on. You've got Alpha Fund, which is a prototyping fund. You've got ICOR, which is when you're starting to step into forming a company, getting customer identification going. And even the RU Institute now is working with one of the groups within WIoT to provide some funds and some guidance. The second thing is there's 2 companies. Okay, and it's a terrific resource. Whenever there's money, go after it. The RU is actually a sort of a low-hanging fruit right now because they're looking to build a program. And they've got lots of money to build a program. The other thing is not everything has to be money. The university has a number of non-monetary things that they offer, resources that they offer. There's the Brinstrom Internet Network. I've matched up a couple of the efforts going in WIoT with people who have background in the area and can provide value on industry connection and so forth. There is some industry connections within WIoT that I think you should push to engage with and understand how your ideas might fit into what they're doing. So there's a lot of resources that are not monetary based, especially for the earlier phases of the commercialization process. All right, so what do you do when you get to the point you're going to launch a business? It starts to get fun. You can see, you start smelling something in the water, on a chum or whatever it is. There's a set of resources you can go after that will help in this way, to give you funding. The first one, which is bootstrapping. Okay, hold on. There we go. Bootstrapping is when you invest in you. This is you sacrificing to build a business. You're sleeping in a garage, eating cornflakes every morning, and just scraping by to try to make the business move forward. There's all sorts of businesses that typically have those. The example is GitHub started in this mode as a bootstrapped organization. Facebook, Apple, Intuit, they all started with some form of bootstrapping and just sort of got to the point that people would start investing money in them. Advantage is it starts today. You effectively can start working on these things when you bootstrap without any overhead of getting the business going. The disadvantage is it's very risky. You can go 6 months having fail and basically you lost 6 months of revenue or whatever it is you need to survive. It doesn't scale. You're going to have to get money, so you have to make some good progress. It puts a little bit of onus on you to make things happen. Friends and family. This is probably one of the biggest sources of early stage funding. When I started my business, it started with bootstrapping, and then we went to friends and family, and I was able to convince people because of these advantages. It's me. They don't have to know the business. They trust me. They're going to invest in me because I'm part of their family or I'm a friend of theirs. And the downside of this simple process and getting money is that if you don't perform, you've now lost money of somebody that you know. It's very different when you lose money of people you don't know from if you know them. The other thing is there's a lot of support structure that comes with later stage money. And that support structure It does not exist with friends and family unless you have Bill Gates in the family or someone who's very, very successful. I already mentioned Northeastern has a whole bunch of funding options. And the reality is it's still competitive, but it's competitive within a smaller realm. And with resources like myself and CRI and so forth, if you're willing to leverage those, you can be successful more of the time in going after that funding. The disadvantage is it's small dollars. Typically, it's when you need less dollars, but it also is small dollars. So there's a little bit of bootstrapping and scraping that goes on when you go down this path. All right, from here you step more into the professional investing side. Professional investors are people who are investing because they want to make money. And it can be very disappointing to talk to someone who only really cares about the money. But the reality is, because they care about their money, they care about a lot of things that are very important to your business, because they know that if you're not successful in these areas, you probably won't be successful as a business. And so your goal is to hit the ball out of the park on all these areas. A lot of them are the things Stacy just talked about that are reviewed for the government. The management team is critical. Who's running the business? If it's one researcher sitting in a lab with a terrific idea, it's not going to go anywhere, because there's a view that a researcher sitting in a lab is not going to be able to go out and do production and do sales and do all the things that are necessary to build a business. So you need to have either advisors or team members that can help fill those gaps. You need a workable business model, meaning you can tell how they're going to make money. Market size does matter. The $1 billion market that Stacy mentioned, that's a good size market. Not all markets are that big, but it has to be big enough that people are convinced you can thrive. The unfair competitive advantage that Stacy talked about is actually pretty important. That's where you have something going for your business nobody else has, and when they hear about it, they're jealous. They start to get scared that you're going to be able to do something they could never do because of that unfair competitive advantage. Very important to think about, what is that advantage you have? If you don't have one, you probably don't have a competitive business. And it's not just product. It's not just a product feature that makes an unfair competitive advantage. It could be that you're first to market. It could be that you have a terrific marketing approach that nobody has thought about. There's all sorts of business ways you can come up with unfair competitive advantages. Customer traction, ownership of IP, we've talked about that, and a plausible path to exit. That means they know how they're going to make money someday. So the people who do that, angel groups, these are groups of people who have typically been successful in business, and they want to help and they want to invest because they think they understand the world a little bit better. They invest early stages. This is after, the very, very early seed stage. This is now the real seed stage, when you start putting a model together. They do more money as a group. They bring experience to you, and they have typically better terms. And terms, I'll talk a little bit about terms at the next training session. Money usually comes with heavy strings attached or less strings attached. And these guys, angel groups, tend to have less strings attached. The VCs just want to make money, so they put lots of strings, and if you fail, they still want to win somehow. It's a difficult group. The disadvantages is they now will do diligence. They will ask questions on the slide before this, and you have to be prepared to answer. Stacy mentioned strategic investors. I actually had a couple very strategic investors in my company. I had AT&T, I had Circuit City. These are really valuable companies, because when a company invests in you, they're investing because they think you're going to help them be successful in the long term. They can make your business. If my business starting to work with Circuit City, when they invest in our company, caused us to grow like a rocket. And then we did a deal with AT&T, and they invested, and we continued to grow like a rocket. So strategics really can make your business. Downside is they can really destroy your business very, very quickly. If they turn off the switch and decide they're not going to work with you anymore, it's a business decision for them. It's much more for you. So be very careful when you deal with them. You understand the strings and how they impact the business. The one everybody hears about is VCs. it would be nice not to have to get money from VCs if you could ever avoid it. But there's a lot of money with VCs. It was the biggest category of investors that you saw on that pie chart. So a lot of people feel they need to go to VCs. Very professional, very business. All they care about is making money. And so it's very disconcerting when you want to grow a business and save the world and they just want to make money, because they don't always match up as those things go forward. The disadvantage, it can be a long process. It can take 3 to 6 months to get money from a VC. They try to control your business. They're not very patient. They become your new boss in many cases. There's a lot to know when you go down this path. Something I'll repeat at the end of this whole presentation is there's resources you have, and I'm one of those resources. If you're getting to the point and you need funding, come talk to me. I'll try to help you in these regards. If it's Stacy's offered to help, these are terrific resources that you can tap into when you get to these stages, and you should. You don't want to learn the hard way. You can spend a lot of time going after the wrong funding. I'm not going to talk through these other than to say there's a lot of other ways to get funding. Some of them are very inefficient. Some of them are more efficient. But suffice it to say that these exist and you can absolutely go down the path of doing this. So in terms of takeaway, start early. It does take time. I think Stacy mentioned on the idea phase, it can take 6 months to get 9 months to get funding. It can take 6 months for later funding. If you have really good friends, cultivate them who have money. Know where you are in the process. The reason I went through the whole phases and process is it matters tremendously when you go talk to someone. And I didn't know this early on, and I'll tell you, you think you talk to 10 VCs that you're making progress, but if you don't talk to the right 10 VCs, you just totally wasted your time. So just make sure you target the right fund. If you go after Spark funding or SBIR funding and you're just not a match for what they do, you'll spend a lot of time and get nothing which could have been predicted early on. Know the motivation and limitations of your investors. And as I said, I would say again, get help. There's a lot to learn, and you don't want to learn through the school of hard knocks because that also adds a lot of time. Any questions? I don't know if people out there can submit questions. Do you see the chat? If anybody does, any questions in here about this? Yeah, it's not bad. I think it's the application giving instructions. Oh, okay. I didn't hear. Was it a question? Oh, okay. Any questions here? I don't want to belabor, but it's okay. No questions. All right. So the next time we're going to talk about how to turn your idea into a company, what role you might have. How do you keep other people from stealing your ideas? One of the biggest concerns I kept hearing over and over from researchers is they're afraid someone's going to take advantage of them. And you're right to be worried, but there's things you can do. And then will you make money? Is there any, I would like to ask back, are there other topics that people would be interested to hear about when it comes to commercialization? And if you don't have it now, you can send me an email with yes.
I think in relation to these two, but we're all working as a sister as well, how to manage sales and company.
How to handle
how to manage the fact that we are probably people.
Oh, okay. During this presentation. Okay, there was a question about, and when we talk through the role, yeah, it could be a dual role with the university and with the company, and we'll make sure we cover that. Any other thoughts about this or other topics you're interested in? So let's do this. Send me an email if you have other topic areas that you'd like to hear about in addition to this next one, because I'm happy to put stuff together. I think this is a great chat. All right.
Okay, this was terrific. Thank you very much, Kat and Stacy. This was a lot of very helpful information condensed in a very more structured way.
Thank you very much. And Stacy, thank you as well. All right, everybody, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.